Okay, very good. So here we are again. Next, well, there's 2 more sessions after this one. Cesar Rodriguez will be with us next week. And then we will have our concluding session. We'll wrap everything up collectively. Today we are very lucky to have on Global Sociology Live my friend Erik Wright, who teaches at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a world-renowned figure in the area of class analysis, something we were talking about last week. And he's written many books in that area, starting with, let's think, Class and the Distribution of Income, another book called Classes, another book called Debates About Classes. Then he's got a book, the last and perhaps culminating book is called Class Counts. Very interesting title. Class Counts. And so he has actually been very prominent in defining all the debates around class, not just in the United States, but globally. His books are translated into many languages. But actually, and he actually hasn't switched his cell phone off either. Terrible. He actually here today because he he pioneered a new sort of branch of sociology, you might say, called real utopias. Starting about 20 years ago, he brought together people who were interested in trying to understand institutions within the world of capitalism that contain within them potential challenges to capitalism. So some of the projects have been to do with democracy, associative democracy, deepening democracy. Then he had early on, I remember he had one session on market socialism. He had most recently one on gender equality, looking for institutions that pose a challenge for capitalism, challenge to capitalism. And it's very important in the context of this course as an alternative way of thinking about the counter movement. You know, so far we've thought about the counter movement to capitalism and the sort of Polanyian way as involving some sort of, well, Evans called it counter-hegemonic globalization. But the idea was to sort of build social movements across national boundaries of one form or another. We heard about the labor movement from Eddie Webster, and last week Amita Bhaviskar talked about environmentalism. And what was interesting, of course, about Amita Bhaviskar's analysis was the importance of class and the ways in which environmentalist movement perhaps also not only challenged capitalism but also reproduced capitalism. And interestingly enough, did a class analysis. And so today what we have is an alternative way, I think, of looking at counter movements, to think of a counter movement as emerging from and generated by the search for institutions that do in fact pose some sort of possibilities that are perhaps, in the case of Erik Wright, I think of a socialist character. And I think that is really what I hope he will talk about in the next 15 minutes.
We'll see.
Okay, we will see. Full of surprises, this man. Okay, so let me welcome Erik Wright.
It's always a special thing to do something completely new, and I have never given a talk in this kind of context. Michael's Sociology Global Live is a whole new way of thinking about presenting ideas and engaged in a global dialogue. And indeed, in a way, this class is itself a real utopia. You know, if you think about it, what would be the way classes should be organized to make the experience not merely one that the people who happen to be lucky enough, privileged enough, to be in a place like this can experience it, but where it can also be a point of departure, a bridge for much broader discussion. And this, in a small way, I would argue, embodies what I'm actually going to be talking about. You know, the point of entry, the reason for this whole enterprise, is a desire to bring concerns about social justice, about dealing with the oppressions that we see around the world, into the heart of sociology. Many sociologists are motivated by social justice concerns. When I heard your statements about what you are interested in, many of you come to this discipline because you're driven by some moral commitment. So that provides your own personal motivation, but often what happens when you actually do sociology is that provides a kind of weak motivation for picking topics, but it doesn't become the central interior focus of what you do. Real utopias then is one way of building an agenda around social justice. I would say its starting point is a very simple claim. I would even call this the foundational claim of a critical sociology. So what's this? What's the foundational claim? Very simple. Much of human suffering that we observe in the world is the result of the way we organize our institutions and social structures. A nice sort of phrase to capture this is that poverty in the midst of plenty is not a law of nature. It's because of the way we organize our society. And implicit in such a claim is that we could organize it differently. Now, if literally you could not organize it differently, if it is the case that these harms, even if we could attribute them to society, to the way we organize things, even if we could do that, but you could not possibly organize it differently, then it is getting rather like a law of nature, right? The law of nature are things that, given the way the powers of gravity and the speed of light works, you can't do it differently. So the claim of a critical sociology then is not merely that poverty in the midst of plenty is the result of our institutions, but that we could do it differently, that these institutions are transformable. A lot of social justice research and thinking, however, mostly focuses on the diagnosis and critique of the way we do things now, of the way our institutions are organized, of the structures of power and domination that build these institutions this way. They focus on the diagnosis and critique of those institutions and give much less attention to the nature of viable alternatives that could transcend these problems, that could do fundamental transformations of how we live and what kinds of harms are eliminated or reduced as a result. And that's also true of lots of social struggles. You know, many social struggles have their sharpest self-understanding in terms of what they oppose rather than what they want to build. Now, that's not always true, of course. Many social struggles embody explicit and implicit visions of alternatives. There are struggles to build, not merely struggles to oppose. But often the build part, the building, not just opposing part of struggles, remains implicit, confused, often contradictory. Wishful thinking is a common fact of social movements, perhaps a necessary condition for social movements. Perhaps the nature of our cultures and our capacities for sacrifice means that we have to have some dreams that are unrealizable as part of our struggle for what is realizable. But the Real Utopias agenda, nevertheless, is to try to really think through this question of alternatives, both as an interesting intellectual puzzle. I mean, I think it's just incredibly interesting to study these things, but also with some kind of hope that this could help inform struggles in the present and in the future, give them greater focus, greater capacity to improvise, because they know more about the menu, you know, what the repertoire of possibilities are. They know what the problems in the existing experiments, so that perhaps some of those problems can be either avoided or they can creatively experiment and find new solutions. The idea of studying real utopias is not to give an array of blueprints. It is absolutely not to play the role of the know-it-all expert that goes to the benighted and uninformed masses and tells them what to do. That's not the purpose of the study of real utopias. The purpose of the study of real utopias is to expand the capacity for learning by the people who are really engaged in struggles and the learning of the people who study those struggles. It's reciprocal. It's very much in the deep spirit of Michael's call for a public sociology that takes the idea of dialogue seriously, not just as a kind of token view. The things I've learned when I've studied real utopias, I learn through dialogue with the people who are doing it. And they, I think, also learn from that dialogue with me, because I have thought for a long time about the abstract categories, the kinds of distinctions that you need to make in order to not be confused about what you're doing. My hope is that I can help increase their capacity to experiment and learn, and they surely increase my capacity to understand as well. That's the kind of dialogic aspect. Well, you've read a couple of things. You know I have big analytical frameworks. I have ways of parsing this world into different pathways of transformation, different models of real utopias. Michael suggested that I not go through the analytical structure in this talk. It's complicated and it's something better to read, I think, than to get thrown at you again in a short time. And rather what he wanted me to do was to run through a couple of the examples, flesh them out a little, you know, just animate them with my enthusiasm about them, say some additional comments. And some of these, of course, will bear on some of the things you've been studying, I'm sure, all semester. I have till what, 5 after? I've done about 5 minutes so far, is that right? Okay. I have, there are 4 examples I wanted to explore, and we may or may not get through all 4. Michael will tell me when I should close this off. First, I want to talk about Wikipedia and its relationship to public libraries. That's the first one, Wikipedia and public libraries. The second is solidarity finance. This is an example that is embedded in the labor movement and can be part of a labor movement struggles for alternatives. And the third is participatory budgeting, an example of incredible innovation from the South that has been spreading to the North rather than from the North to the South. So first, Wikipedia. Yesterday, I spent the afternoon at the Wikimedia Foundation in San Francisco, brought there by a former sociology student, undergraduate at Berkeley, Annie Lin, who is working for the Wikimedia Foundation. It was fantastic. I mean, it really is, that's the home of a real utopia, in my view. When you think about Wikipedia, you know, it's something everybody uses. Most people don't quite realize what it is. It's the world's largest encyclopedia in history, made freely available to everybody in the world, now in 250 languages. Separate Wikipedias. Those aren't translations of the English Wikipedia. Each language has its own Wikipedia process with its own volunteer editors. It's produced entirely by people who do it because they want to, voluntary cooperation. It's egalitarian. Anybody can do it. You can all be Wikipedians if you want to. If you look at Wikipedia and you see, and you're looking for some sociology topic and you see a topic that's badly written, that's underdeveloped, you can become an editor and improve it. It's egalitarian in that way. Incredibly interesting in terms of how it's evolved. There's lots of angles around this, so it's a phenomenal real utopia. But it's not a complete real utopia even in its own terms. Because one of the conditions for this fantastic resource to be made available to every person in the world is that every person in the world has to have access to the internet. Now in the US, I don't know, it's probably 60% or 70% of households now do, but it's still not 100%. And in Rwanda, it's probably 1%. I have no idea what the coverage is in a very poor country. And that's where public libraries come in. Now, public libraries are a very different kind of institution. Public library is a state institution. It's a public institution. It mobilizes resources by taxing part of the social surplus and removing it from the sphere of capital accumulation and moving it into the sphere of social accumulation to build resources for collective use. The ideal public library, you know, the kind of best public libraries create public space, not just access to resources. Meeting rooms. Sometimes public libraries have small stages so that amateur theater groups can have a public space that's inexpensive for them to get access to. Public libraries make books available to people on the basis of 2 each according to need. And it's rationed by time. You have to wait on a waiting list to get the books, not rationed by your ability to pay. Libraries are a fundamentally anti-capitalist institution. They embody a different logic about how people should have their needs met. Everybody should have equal access to the conditions to flourish with respect to the access to information. And public libraries are a remarkable way of accomplishing that. It's a big irony that the United States, this hyper-capitalist country where, you know, it's every person for themselves and the market should dictate the allocation of everything, that we happen to have probably the best public library system in the world. I'm not 100% sure of that, but it's certainly better than any that I've seen elsewhere. Every small town has a public library. Originally financed, I don't know if you know the history, Andrew Carnegie financed with his fortune. He basically used a vast part of his fortune to build libraries all over the country. That's a nice irony of American history. In this era of terrible budget cuts, many communities are not prepared to defend cuts to Medicaid or cuts to the police, but they do defend the cuts to the library. In Philadelphia, the one big mass mobilization that blocked an austerity plan was to keep the public libraries open. So this is an incredible resource. Well, it's a resource that interfaces with Wikipedia because libraries are a way to make the internet available to everyone, free of charge. And that's what libraries do, and that's what libraries do in poor countries as well. So the vision of Wikipedia, of free information to every single person on the planet by proliferating the languages in which it's available and by expanding the editorial competence of people who work on it, is only possible because of its interconnection with a public institution. Okay, that's Wikipedia. Okay, I'll skip to participatory budgeting, and then if I have time, I'll sneak in solidarity finance. Participatory budgeting, very different kind of real utopia. Participatory budgeting is a way of reorganizing city budgets. This afternoon at 5 o'clock, actually, there is a symposium in Berkeley at Worst Hall, I believe. Worcester Hall? Okay. About the prospects and possibilities of participatory budgeting in the United States. There's a kind of national participatory budget project that has a kind of road show, and they bring it to different places, and it'll be in Berkeley this evening at 5 o'clock. Should be really good. The people involved with it are excellent. Participatory budgeting was started in Porto Alegre, a city in southeastern Brazil. By Brazilian standards, a relatively prosperous region of the country, but still clearly in the global south. The idea of the participatory budgeting is that the budgets for a city need not be produced by a panel of experts in the mayor's office, beholden to power centers that are trying to bargain for their particular needs. The budget could be decided, its basic priorities set, the specific projects, particularly for infrastructure, determined by direct popular participation in citizens' assemblies. It's essentially trying to figure out how you can have a New England-style town meeting where anybody can participate in both the debates and the vote on priorities, a participatory town meeting. How do you do that in a big city, a city of 101.5 million people? Well, you do it by creating neighborhood assemblies, having a process which became fairly elaborate but still tractable over a 3-month period where meetings occur, people bring petitions, they discuss priorities, and then they organize these priorities into a set of priorities. How many of them will actually be accomplished depends upon the budget constraint. So you first set your priorities independent of the budget constraint, and then you see how many of those priorities you can actually do in a given budget cycle. And the budget items that don't get dealt with in one year then will tend to move up the list on subsequent years. So you have these direct assembly meetings, and then you have a delegational process by which people from these direct neighborhood meetings meet in a citywide budget council to bring all the budget priorities from around the city together to produce a coherent budget. That's been going on in Porto Alegre now for 20 years, very successfully. Some years, a lot of participation. Other years, when there's not much discretionary budget to deal with, the participation flags. But the basic robustness of this democratic participation has been there throughout, and it's produced a dramatic change in the way the city budget is actually used, what actually happens in it. It's now a city budget in which the poorer the neighborhood, the more gets spent on it. Whereas it used to be, as in most places in the world, the poorer the neighborhood, the more gets spent on it. A complete change in the slope of the relationship between need and spending. And certainly a change in an egalitarian direction. Well, how does this come to the United States? The city of Chicago has a peculiar budgetary device, which is that every aldermanic district in the city gets a discretionary budget of $1 million+ a year, in which the alder for that district can do whatever they want with it. I suppose they can't legally just pocket it, but they can, hold festivals, they can pave the streets in front of their prime contributors, they can use it for clientelistic and patronage kinds of reasons. However they want. They get this discretionary pot available. Well, in the Rogers Park district, the alderman Joe Moore, who's going to be at this symposium this afternoon, he's one of the speakers, the guy who decided, oh, this would be cool to do in my district. He went to the U.S. Social Forum in Atlanta, 2008, I believe, or 7 or sometime, in the recent past. Went to a workshop on participatory budget in Porto Alegre, and he had this idea. Why don't I just do it in my own district? He has complete discretion. He can use this money however he wants. I'll just let the people in the district tell me how to use it. So they organized neighborhood assemblies where people discussed priorities. They had a whole methodology for doing this, and they came up with a list of priorities which included fixing some sidewalks in part of the district, improving some parks, and having some festivals, among other things. They decided on these lists. They voted on them in a citizens' assembly, a town hall meeting, and that's how they spent the money. In this year's Chicago aldermanic elections, city council elections held in January, and then the second round, I guess February, and the second round, I believe, in April or late March, another 12 alders ran on participatory budgeting, so that next year there's going to be, I believe, 13 different aldermanic districts in the city which will have a participatory budget. Now, it's a small budget. It's in a big city like Chicago. $1 million isn't a huge amount of money, but it's not trivial. And it's not trivial for the kinds of things which a bunch of people in the neighborhood could see as really enhancing the quality of life in a kind of day-to-day way for certain things that they care about. Well, that's just the beginning, though. Once you introduce an innovation like this, people try it. They find that it's interesting. It becomes a school for democracy. People become better at it. And there will be, undoubtedly, proposals throughout the United States in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years to have participatory budgets that go beyond just small fringe things in budgets. I think this will be one of the, the next big things, one of the things that becomes a fad, of course. It'll be used and misused. Some cities it will be just a device for existing city bosses to manipulate and control particular constituencies. In others it will become a vibrant source of new conflict and new ideas for new participation. Participatory budget is an extraordinary example, I think, of real utopias. Created out of struggle. The Workers' Party won an election in Brazil. That's how they did it. Innovated in Chicago, not out of struggle. Alderman Joe Moore was not under any popular pressure to introduce a participatory budget. He did it because he thought it was interesting and cool. But now it's in the menu. Now it's something that local struggles in which you feel that the priorities set by the cities because of property interests are out of whack with the needs of people, where people can now mobilize around an alternative model. Not just mobilize against the influence of real estate and business interests, but mobilize for an alternative way of creating the budget. Given that in American politics today the issue of the budget is such a big and powerful issue, having an alternative model for a people's budget and how to produce such a budget seems to me an important aspect of possible futures. Okay.
Very good. Terrific. So actually, as you know, there are other real utopias that Erik has written about, and so you shouldn't feel somehow inhibited about talking about them. Worker cooperatives, and we had, of course, quite a long discussion about unconditional basic income.
Right.
He's totally happy to talk about those, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You should also know that Erik will be president of the American Sociological Association next year, and he is organizing the whole American sociology in Denver with the theme of real utopias. And I should also mention that a book, of course, has just come out, well, a year ago, I guess,
yeah.
it now, Envisioning Real Utopias, which combines both an account of real utopias, but also his very fancy pictures and diagrams that indicate the different trajectories into the future. Okay, well, let us begin our discussion. Who would like to start? Ida.
Sure. I think that in your article, we've read an article which is summarizing the book. You point out that this idea of the real utopia is, or what you're presenting, is a critique of capitalism. It's a theory of alternatives, and it's a theory of transformation. And now I think what you've sort of given us is maybe not a theory of alternatives, but some alternatives.
Right, some illustrations.
Some illustrations of the alternative that you are envisioning, or that we can move towards. I think that what we ended up in our discussion on Monday concluding was that, in some way, the transformation part of how to get towards the real utopias, or how these these examples that you're giving us now can be part of a transformation to an alternative to capitalism. Because as we're living now, Wikipedia exists within capitalism without it necessarily being a challenge to where we are now. So I was wondering if you could maybe bring it up to a theoretical level of this transformation and describe to us how this can be seen also in a global perspective, seeing as that is the goal of this class.
Okay, so I think let's break the problem of transformation into two parts. One part is the question of what kinds of changes that are achievable now will contribute to some broader structure of changes in the long term. Because if there's one thing that it's clear, a fundamental, complete transformation of capitalism is not achievable now. It's not a failure of our imagination. The social forces and the institutional possibilities and the historical openings just do not exist for some radical reconstruction of capitalism into an alternative in the immediate achievable future. So what might be achievable are various kinds of reforms, new innovations, new institutions, which constitute alternatives and are part of a process of transformation, but which in and of themselves don't destroy capitalism. So that's one part of the thing. What are the way state? I refer to that as the way station problem. The intermediate steps, the kinds of changes which, if continued and cumulatively develop, would constitute more fundamental change, even if they themselves don't. And the second problem is the question of agency. What are the social forces capable of pushing forward, opening up new spaces and occupying those spaces? Right. Now, these are separable problems, but of course they're not separate in the world. Having good, clear ideas of way stations is one of the ways of eliciting more agency. People are prepared, I think, to struggle for things that are achievable, especially when they see them as building some bigger vision. My own focus has been more on the way stations, on these new institutions. I have more intuitions about it. My own theoretical understanding seems richer about that. I have more to say about that. I have less to say about the agency question. It seems to me highly contingent upon the specificities of different situations, exactly what coalitions and what opportunities occur. The Porto Alegre case is a nice one in that respect. So here you had Brazil coming out of 2 decades of dictatorship, was in a transition to democracy. In Porto Alegre, it happened to be the case that the Workers' Party was a kind of grassroots-based, labor-based party with a very left-wing ideology, animated by rather romantic revolutionary notions of dual power, a kind of Trotskyist inspired wing to the Workers' Party. And they, by accident, won the mayor's election. They didn't have a majority. They didn't win the city council. They won the mayor's election because the opposition split the vote, and it was a first-past-the-post election. So they won the mayor's election, and they had to figure out what the hell are we going to do. They figured they only had 4 years because they didn't anticipate being able to win a second election. You know, they anticipated a one-cycle politics, and they wanted to figure out a way that they could actually have an impact on the city. And they came up with the participatory budget as an innovation. Well, I don't think any theory of collective action, of agency, could have either predicted that or even really said, you know, under what circumstances will a participatory budget, you know, it's too complicated, too many contingencies, too much specificity. I'm not saying that people on the ground in Porto Alegre couldn't have thought, yes, there's some possibilities on the horizon. But the important thing I think we can do is say what to do when you get those opportunities. And that's where I think this institutional focus really has its payoff. That combined with a very flexible view about the nature of the struggles that could actually seize the time, take the opportunities.
Okay. Aaron.
Okay, so in the spirit of this class being a utopia, I'm going to ask you, if it's okay with you, a first question, and then you'll potentially respond, and then I'll ask another second question,
Sure.
as opposed to just being sort of
Sure, absolutely.
one-directional and sort of bi-directional to be multiple.
You have my permission for that procedure.
Okay, we haven't done that.
Your benign philosopher king here can decide whether
the Godfather.
at one point, Godfather.
So
The capo di capo.
So first, thank you for offering these visions of prefigurative utopias, and it makes me think about the Chomsky and Foucault debate of 1971, when Foucault refused to offer utopias, concerned about having to articulate what it means to be human or articulate the human condition. So I think you're very courageous to begin a conversation that some
Foolhardy.
some great minds sort of have resisted.
Yeah, just a little comment, and I don't mean this to preempt your. I don't experience this as even in the slightest bit courageous. It's just not the dimension on which I find this exciting and interesting, a natural evolution of things I've thought about as part of a global sort of left puzzle and problem. And I don't feel like I'm doing something that makes me vulnerable in any way, even if I get sharp opposition. But, you know, of course that's a statement. The fact that I don't feel it's courageous is partially a statement of my privilege. I'm a tenured professor at a major university. It protects me. It makes it possible for me to do things without courage that may still nevertheless be important and good. So just...
We may continue, Aaron.
So your work seems to be avoiding this assumption or a sort of declaration of what it means to be human, with one exception, and that is human flourishing. So would it be possible for you to define what this means, to sort of what is human flourishing, and in conjunction with the answer that you gave to this first question, is this flourishing a form of like this liberal agency to achieve one's inherent qualities? So maybe in talking about human flourishing, maybe you could also speak and define what is agency for you. Okay,
so I have a deliberately both expansive and underspecified concept of flourishing. I don't want to suggest that there's only one way to flourish. There are many ways to flourish. I don't want it to be a narrowly kind of American individualistic understanding, although that's a perfectly good one, I think. It's one of the ways of flourishing. But I don't want it to be an empty signifier either. One aspect of flourishing, I think, is simpler, and it kind of may help set the terms. So we can think of flourishing in terms of bodily health as well. A person flourishes in terms of their health and their body, not merely when they are not diseased. It's not, you know, that's part of it. Not having the flu is part, and other diseases is part of flourishing. But there's also a notion of being kind of bodily energetic and vital and feeling good, positive in your bodily existence. Now, I think that's a pretty universal feature. There will be cross-cultural variations in exactly what aspects of that are the most salient. There There are even some very special cases where there may be cultural validation, valuing of depression and misery and, emaciation and so on. Those are pretty rare outliers. And, if you're a complete cultural relativist, you would perhaps say, well, that's just another way of flourishing. I'm prepared to be more restrictive than that and take what most people in the world most of the time would consider the difference between being sick and well and vibrantly healthy versus just not sick. Okay, so for bodily functioning, it's not so hard. I just extend that to other aspects of life that make for a rich and fulfilled good life, but don't restrict the content of it very much. It does have something to do with realizing potential. It doesn't imply that every person has just some unique potential to be realized, but it does have something to do with the fact that we are capable of mastery, of creativity, and there's many ways to do that, and a flourishing life is one in which those potentials get nurtured and realized rather than blocked and thwarted.
Okay, so given this definition of human flourishing as a sort of feeling that the body is healthy and then the feeling good about the body, which seems to have a psychological component, the sort of utopias that you provide tend to solve or look at redistribution as the sort of center for human flourishing. But there are, as Nancy Fraser has argued, there are many other sort of injustices that have so much to do with misrecognition, right? Which can have an impact. Let's say homophobia has an impact on someone's psychological health. That gender domination that doesn't allow for a transgender woman to live. Xenophobia doesn't allow, produces the violence against the body because the person is misrecognized as not part of the state. So
you didn't read in the book. There's a much more elaborate discussion of these issues. So if you're interested, I would recommend you look at that. It's in the first substantive chapter. It may be chapter 2. It's chapter 2, I guess. So I define two dimensions of justice: social justice and political justice. And my definition of social justice is the following: a just society is one in which all people have equal access to both the social and material means necessary to live a flourishing life. So I include the social as well. I mean, in addition to material, the social means to live a flourishing life. And that's where the recognition dimension. So equal access to the social means to live a flourishing life means equal access to a community of mutual recognition and support, the absence of stigma and of status denigration and so on. So the social and material are both there, not just the material conditions. And that's where I include that. I say equal access to those means, not equal opportunity. Equal opportunity is a similar formulation. I'm not against equal opportunity. I think equal opportunity, first of all, it's consistent with a lottery. Right? In a lottery, everybody has an equal opportunity to win. And if we had a lottery for the conditions to flourish, that was a fair lottery, everybody had an equal chance, it would satisfy an equal opportunity criterion. It wouldn't satisfy an equal access to the conditions of. So I prefer access to opportunity. Also, equal opportunity sometimes is interpreted as starting gate opportunity. As long as by the time you're an adult you have an equal opportunity. If you squander your opportunities, if you blow it, too bad. You've had a fair shot. Whereas equal access is a more generous understanding. It says, look, people screw up all the time, both for all sorts of reasons. What we want is a world in which people throughout their life have equal access. And of course it means we're going to have to compromise on that. That's the ideal. There's limited resources. You're not going to be able to literally give equal access throughout a life to somebody who's continually squandering the resources which they have available. But you do the best possible with respect to that as the ideal. And then the real utopian question is what institutions facilitate or hinder that?
Okay, Peel.
Hi. Thank you very much for coming here and talking to us, and for the text. It was really interesting. I hope it's okay. I ask you a question which is a little bit more like theoretical or related to some of the things we read. I agree about the real utopias and the great possibilities, but I have some problems with your theoretical viewpoints or the way you imagine transformation. And I think the reason why it's also important is what you write yourself, that actually providing possibilities or making people see possibilities is also a way of changing them. So I think the theoretical fundament of the way you imagine transformation is also an important thing to discuss. Basically, I think I see the problem with the way you understand production. And the way you just do divide society into this model that we've been working with ourselves in this course, and like civil society, production, and then the state. And I think it's problematic because in that way you also understand the production of value as something which is happening very isolated in the economic sphere, instead of seeing like a process of value production as something much more broad connected to what's happening outside the economic sphere, outside the labor market, in like more immaterial, emotional, and social production. And I think the big problem with your viewpoint in seeing economy as a separate sphere from what we call like society is that you, in that sense, I see that you reproduce a capitalist discourse of understanding how value is created or what value is. And I think that seeing the civil society as detached from economy is also not recognizing the fundamental productive value that human life is and the human ability to produce value. And I think in your idea what it ends up with, I'll finish now, is if you see these spheres as divided, you will never be able actually to transcend or to create another society which is not a capitalist society. What you will be able to do is that you can definitely restrict capitalism very much. You can do it like, as we see in a social democracy. I'm from a social democracy myself. We restrict capitalism a lot. We do not transcend capitalism, and that's not possible because of our basic understanding of what value is and how value is productive.
Okay, so important and difficult questions. So let's see
if we can do it in 2 minutes.
Godfather. Some things need 3.
All right, very good.
Let me say a couple of things. Words like sphere or domain or levels, all these metaphors we use in social theory, all have traps. When I talk about the state and civil society and the economy, I don't mean by making those analytical distinctions that these are separate, isolated spaces that only after they are constituted interact with each other. No, I see these as a set of analytical distinctions as a way of talking about dimensions of social interaction. In which, and the key for my analysis is that these are dimensions of social interaction around which power gets formulated. So there's a difference between the kind of power that I associate with civil society that is bound up with our capacity for voluntary cooperative action, collective action, and which is rooted in our ability to persuade each other to work together, versus the kind of power that's rooted in what I'm calling the economy, which is power based on your ownership and control over resources. Now, those aren't the same kinds of power. If one thinks that all there is amorphous power and it has no dimensions, there's no variation, it's one thing, capital P power, then I think you're disabled from talking about institutional changes. If, on the other hand, you see different forms of power as completely unconnected with each other, that they don't interact, that they don't mutually constitute each other, you're also disabled. You need analytical distinctions so that you can have tractable ways of talking about variation. State power is the capacity to impose rules on territory and enforce those rules. That's a distinctive kind of power. It's not the same as the power that comes from controlling a lot of capital and being able to buy things and get people to do things for you because you can bribe them. So my little slogan to distinguish these 3 forms of power is, if you want to get somebody to do something, you can bribe them, you can force them, or you can persuade them. My real utopian transformations are an attempt at figuring out ways in which power that's based on the capacity for voluntary cooperation becomes more and more central in the overall configuration of power. It's a re-articulation of these different types of power in ways that increases the depth and importance of our collective action and our capacity for voluntary cooperation as a source of power in the society. And I don't see how to talk about that without distinguishing it from these other sources of power which can thwart the capacity for collective action. And that's all I'm doing by talking about these three spheres and their forms of power and the configurations and re-articulations of them. So the challenge for somebody who's uncomfortable with that, who thinks there's something inherently constraining about that language, is to propose an alternative that actually gives you more action, that actually tells you more about why Wikipedia is not the same as a capitalist way of producing encyclopedias, and why public libraries are a valuable space to defend. If there is an alternative set of analytical distinctions and language for talking about power and transformation, that would better demarcate these possibilities and show their tensions with capitalism and their potential for transcendence, I would abandon this instantly. I just haven't encountered anything that gives me more traction on these problems.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, Jelena, then Lilia.
Yeah, thank you so much for your lecture. And we actually talked a lot on Monday about basic income, and basic income as one of your examples of real utopias. And a question that emerged during the discussion is that, for example, in some countries, like in Scandinavian countries that we talk about, tax system is very similar to your definition of basic income. In Global South, maybe people would like to engage in something similar, but there are no capital and financial means. Meanwhile, for example, in US, even though there are capital and financial means, people would not accept something like that. So would you say that the entire notion of basic income as real utopia is in the US, it's kind of American-centric, because in other parts of the world is viewed differently?
Well, in the US, it's a kind of unreal utopia in the sense that it's unachievable, not that it's unworkable if we had it. No, I don't think it's a particularly American-centric idea. It originated outside of the US.
Maybe I expressed myself wrong, so that it's utopia specifically for the US, meanwhile in other parts of the world is maybe more accepted and more...
Well, even in Scandinavia, you don't have unconditional basic income. That is, in Scandinavia, you have a very complex patchwork of targeted programs, means-tested programs, special purpose programs, which taken all together come close to, but still there are gaps in it. The unconditionality of basic income and its universality are key to what renders it something really different. Because what it does is it enormously frees up people to do things other than engage in ordinary capitalist employment as a way of reproducing their own lives, meeting their basic needs. So if you think of, for example, if you accept the idea that a worker co-op constitutes a democratically run egalitarian worker co-op constitutes an alternative model for how a firm could be organized, one of the problems that worker co-ops have is they have to eat. Right? So a worker co-op, when the group of workers want to set up a co-op, they have to generate a stream of income very quickly because they can't wait 2 years for it to work. They have to get a stream of income very quickly. They go to a bank to get credit, to capitalize their firm. The bank knows the workers have to eat, and the bank is hesitant to give a loan because they feel that the workers will eat their capital rather than use it productively. If workers had an unconditional basic income, it would help them get loans from banks to start firms, because the bank would know the workers have a stream of income guaranteeing their basic necessities, and therefore the bank's concern is merely whether the business plan for what the worker co-op is going to do is credible, not whether in addition to that it's going to feed the members. Right? So unconditional basic income opens up a space for worker co-ops.
All right. So is it feasible elsewhere, like in your case, Rwanda?
Well, in Namibia, there's an experiment in unconditional basic income. In one region of the country, I think Ford Foundation funded it, and it had an enormously beneficial effect on all sorts of things in the lives of people. Poor countries are not necessarily in a worse position for basic income because, as we know, what counts as an adequate basic income to live a culturally respectable life is also much lower in a place like Namibia. So for peanuts, basically, so to speak, from the point of view of global resources, people can be guaranteed an unconditional basic income in Namibia. What they then do, because they live in extended kin compounds, they can pool their basic incomes, and they suddenly have a resource that they can use to buy all sorts of things that improve the quality of life and the standard of life of people. So health improvements were dramatic, but also productivity improvements were dramatic with this manna from heaven, because it was not, the basic income was not coming from taxation internal to the society. There was no redistribution. It was coming from the global north. So I think, and there's talk in South Africa, there was some talk in Brazil about the possibilities of sort of basic income. So I don't know where the breakthrough will happen for this to occur. My guess it's more likely in advanced welfare states in Europe than it is in the South. There is a discussion of basic income in some European contexts, because there it represents a big administrative simplification of an overly complex system. And it's even been argued that an unconditional basic income in a place like Norway or Sweden or possibly Denmark would actually reduce the total tax burden, because you could provide everybody with basic subsistence and save a huge amount on the administrative overhead of all these special programs.
Very good. Kevin?
Going back to the basic income, looking at places in like the global south where there's still struggle to even just establish a minimum wage. What do you see the prospects of a basic income developing in those areas? And just generally going back to the United States, what do you think it would take for the United States to be pressured into coming close to something, or even considering having the basic income become even something to be considered in a mainstream dialogue or discourse?
I mean, we're not even close to basic health care. So, and the centerpiece of our political debate is whether or not to dismantle Medicare. You know, and privatize Social Security so we can once again have impoverished and starving elderly. You know, go back to the 1920s. So, you know, we're so far behind the curve on any kind of progressive innovations on these sorts of things. It is worth noting, however, that one of the most conservative political economy type commentators and writers, Charles Murray, a real reactionary, you know.
This is going global, Eric. You don't want to say that.
He would acknowledge that. He probably wouldn't use the word reactionary. He would certainly acknowledge super conservative. He's in favor of an unconditional basic income. What he wants to do is completely scrap every other welfare provision, you know, get rid of everything and replace it with an unconditional basic income for everybody. Now, you know, his motivations are that would actually be cheaper than all these other things, but also he sees it as less interference in the market. You know, there's this peculiar point. If everybody just has this resource, then you can just not regulate the market at all. And there's no minimum wage anymore. Employers can offer whatever somebody's willing to work for. Why should $1 an hour be illegal if I have my basic subsistence guaranteed independently of the labor market? So you get rid of the, you know, all these other rules. So there are conservatives who like this idea. An emancipatory basic income that creates the sort of foundations for what Philippe van Parijs calls real freedom for all, and enhances people's capacity to invent new ways of forming socially productive activities. That kind of basic income, of course, isn't consistent with Charles Murray's view. The U.S. is going to not be the innovator on this. We may become an innovator on other things, though. I think participatory budgeting, because of our long traditions of local democratic governance and the more distant traditions of the town hall meeting, I mean, all these are part of our political history and cultural repertoire. I think participatory budgeting could actually take off in the U.S. as a real new possibility, and then feed back into other kinds of changes as well.
Okay, Lilia.
Thank you for creating an optimistic environment, I guess, atmospherical potentials. I'm sorry if I read this. I'm still kind of getting over my fear on cameras.
It's okay.
I believe that the world of academia plays an important role in the conceptualization of social realms in terms of shaping the way that social relations are played out. And Wikipedia is a wonderful phenomenon that spreads a powerful tool knowledge. Yet the world of academia doesn't accept it as a viable source for information, and it undermines its value, supporting the idea that the public is not a reliable source. So will there have to be a change in the realm of academia to help transform in creating a public agency? And do you see a change in its viability in the academic realm in the future?
Well, first of all, just on the claim about professors' attitudes towards Wikipedia, it's changed a lot in the last couple of years. 5 years ago, there was nothing but snotty disdain for it. Now it would be hard, you'd be hard-pressed to find many professors who never themselves use Wikipedia.
Secretly.
And many of them, you know, I know lots of professors, of course I would be a case, but not just me, who in dealing with students say, look, it's an incredibly useful first place to go. The best articles have a fantastic set of links to other places. Any fact or observation you get from Wikipedia, you have to check against some other source. But it's a terrific place to begin an exploration of a topic. Also, just so you know, as the incoming president of the American Sociological Association, one of my initiatives is a big ASA Wikipedia project. That's one of the reasons I was at the Wikimedia Foundation yesterday, to create a portal on the ASA website which will both train sociologists and encourage them to make contributions to Wikipedia in order to upgrade the sociology entries. So as a community of scholars and students interested in social knowledge...
Takes his real utopias very seriously.
You know, Wikipedia has been, until relatively recently, a kind of helter-skelter, willy-nilly, everybody does what the hell they want, without there being organized constituencies and communities who say, no, we care about this. It's a wonderful resource, but let's try to improve it. The Wikimedia Foundation itself has launched a new utility on Wikipedia called Wiki Projects, where a group of people can get together on any theme that they might be interested. You know, there's probably a Star Trek Wiki project in which they identify themselves and they become then the curators of the whole array of entries connected with their theme. And they rate them by quality and they indicate ones that need improvement and do the things that you need to upgrade it and to improve the standards. There already is a sociology wiki project that sociologists around the world have already spontaneously formed. And the idea then would be that the ASA will not take that over, but that we will mobilize the resources of the American Sociological Association and the community around it to interface with the Wiki Project Sociology project already. You can see future classroom assignments that, you know, some of you will become sociology teachers, so 10 years from now, a standard senior seminar assignment will be to find some entry in sociology that you think is woefully underdeveloped and rewrite it, expand it, and participate in the contribution to this global resource.
Very good.
Thank you.
Billy, I probably have to, I'll ask questions. Who else has got wants to ask a question? Brian? Laura? Okay, well, start with Billy.
So thank you for your talk. And for me, I was caught up around the last section around theories of transformation.
Speak up.
Sorry.
Speak in and speak up.
My voice there. But for me, instead of seeing ruptural transformation as purely an act of negation or like antagonism, I see it as a prescriptive method or something that tells us how we speak and how we should be understood. So I study recent race riots in the U.S. as a method of a population speaking instead of as a method of a population, let's say, attacking necessarily. And so what I've been trying to grapple with is that, you know, in the first few years of most of our adulthoods, we witnessed our country kill 1 million people between 2003 and 2006, right? in a war. And for me, that tells me that collapse for some people in this world comes very suddenly. It isn't something where we can sit here and say, well, there's nothing that'll change. Suddenly, it's not viable. For a lot of people, things change very quickly. And I think, for me, I wonder where the line is to draw between an alternative or a real utopia and merely a refined kind of capital or a refined kind of state. And then beyond that, I also, for instance, is the free university just like the reading room within a prison or something, and how do these techniques or how do these alternatives actually serve to silence or distract us from real anger or real sort of a force of collapse or something, instead of dealing with that.
So a lot of the collapses that happen in the world are catastrophes. They intensify human suffering beyond belief, as opposed to being the point of entry to an emancipatory future. So my concern with ruptural transformation is not by any means a denial that ruptures happen all the time. But the question then is whether ruptural strategies increase or decrease the prospects for emancipatory transformation, for actually creating the conditions for human flourishing, right? Sometimes they do. So I'm not opposed, and this is clearer, I think, in the book perhaps than in the article. I'm not categorically opposed to ruptural transformation, certainly not on the basis of any foundational principle. That is, it's not that I say ruptural transformations are so inherently flawed that they can never be an important part of a transformative struggle. And furthermore, I think that there are aspects of ruptural strategy, the kind of confrontational aspect, where the goal is to defeat an opponent, not to work out a zone of compromise. That's the ruptural imagery is of warfare, where there's a battle and a winner and a loser. Sometimes that's a necessary condition for the possibility of what I call interstitial and symbiotic transformations to occur. But ruptural transformations, in order for them to be emancipatory, I think always have to be articulated to interstitial and symbiotic. As standalone strategies, they're much better at destroying than they are of building. And it's basically easy, fundamentally it's easier to destroy than to build. Maybe hard to destroy as well. Easier to confront than to imagine an alternative. So it may be a legitimate expression of anger and rage, but not in a way that will then create. Anger can be destructive. It's not always, even if it's understandable, even if we understand why people are rageful, it's not necessarily contributing to human emancipation. It can be just catharsis, but not emancipation. So my concern is with how, if there is rage, if there is anger, how to harness it in ways that productively produce better conditions for human flourishing, as opposed to just arenas for expressive action.
Okay.
It's difficult for me to separate sort of these techniques from those collapses. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do these techniques actually sustain those collapses, and repeat those collapses over and over? Techniques, and I mean, as far as real utopias. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
so
abstract to say that we can have participatory budgeting here, and then we could be blowing up things over there.
Well, we can. The world's contradictory. There's there's wonderfully creative and humane and just things that happen in the United States in the midst of the horrors we wreak on the rest of the world. But it's not the same we. There's not a unitary we that constitutes this reified entity, the United States. We're a complex social structure with many institutions that are internally fractured and contradictory as well as in opposition to each other. And the we's of people building new urban agriculture in Milwaukee and Detroit to deal with the food desert through very interesting innovations about both in the kind of technological sense about how you do agriculture inside of a city, but also social sense of how you integrate communities into the production of food in this post-apocalyptic Detroit, for example. Really good stuff going on. That is happening in the United States. It's very advanced, along with the destruction of that city and the destruction of other parts of the world. So, I mean, those are incredibly contradictory, but I don't think it invalidates at all the real utopian emancipatory aspect of these new innovations when they occur.
Okay, why don't you two just ask your questions briefly, and then I'll give Eric 30 seconds to respond.
And I can
More
stay
important, you can stay afterwards too, but
yeah.
anyway, just why don't you at least have them on the record? Laura.
Hi, thanks for being here today with us. My question is more of like a clarification in regards to your article and also a comment that you made earlier today. You said that with, for instance, unconditional basic income, that it would eliminate things like, you know, welfare. But there's this stigma against, you know, welfare, and we think of like food stamps and a lot of that, a lot of those things. But also, if we think of welfare as some kind of state aid for certain people, would that also include, for instance, homeowners' subsidies, and also other kinds of tax breaks for the really rich, particularly also laws that privilege people with like real estate?
So when I say it gets rid of welfare, what I mean is all the income transfer programs that are used to support people's lives can be eliminated and replaced with an unconditional basic income, which will not have stigma attached to it because it's universal. Everybody gets it. You know, everybody gets this every month, so there's no differentiation. Bill Gates gets it, and you know, a homeless person gets it. So it's unconditional and universal. So it gets rid of the stigma. It doesn't mean that all other programs, other than income transfer programs, would disappear. There might be good public policy reasons or bad ones to have subsidies for homeowners through the mortgage interest deduction. I think it's generally a very bad policy because it's so inegalitarian. But to have one that was an inverse progressive subsidy, so that the less expensive the house, the bigger the subsidy, you know, so it was graded that way, that could be a good policy. You know, so
good man. Brian.
Hello. Earlier today you highlighted kind of how backwards the U.S. discourse is within the U.S. politics. I think part of that, one aspect of that, of the discourse, is like the rhetoric that's used. And when you, at least I feel I interpreted that you kind of redefined socialism from how we've traditionally interpreted it, understood it. And within that process, I feel you've kind of like liberated it in a way to kind of be able to take on a new form, something that is kind of maybe more viable. At least, but within U.S. politics, I feel the term socialism has been so politicized that regardless of any distinctions we make between statism, capitalism, and socialism, that it's not a viable term.
Right.
And I was wondering if you've ever given any thought, because I've tried thinking about this for years now, like what term, new term, to define these like core principles could be used to, I suppose, just would be more viable.
So you're absolutely right. My mother, who is a academic, just to the end, even after the book was published, would scold me for insisting on using the word socialism for just exactly that reason. She supports the ideas of the book and its values, but feels that in the American context it's a non-starter. Well, first of all, the book wasn't written for an American context. And the dialogue in which I've been engaged, which both nurtured the book as it was being written and which I hope the book contributes, is a global one. And in much of the word socialism still signals the core stance against capitalism. And no other word does the work. So that's part of the answer. The word in the American political vocabulary that is best for capturing a lot of this is democracy. You know, that's a good American word. It's one of our core values. Talking about deepening democracy, making democracy real, having economic democracy that really is democratic, ruled by the people, right? So if democracy is ruled of, by, and for the people, and we talk about the economy should be democratic too. It should be ruled of, by, and for the people. And the state should be really democratic, not a perverse kind of thin democracy controlled by wealth. Well, deepening democracy is really social empowerment. And if, you know, it could be an alternative rhetorical framing of the problem. We want to democratize the economy and democratize the state. Nearly everything that I'm talking about could be packaged in that way. The part that isn't exactly in that is the are the issues that are connected to ownership, to exploitation, to the property rights aspect, which, that's another discussion we haven't broached here. Socialism is a combination of democracy, democratic power and social ownership. So this is getting the democratic power part of it, and it's kind of ignoring the social ownership part, which is, I think, important from a theoretical point of view, but it may not be so important to worry about that from a kind of political discourse point of view.
Very good. So redefining socialism is where we end. Very good. Thank you very much, Erik. That was fantastic. Thank you.